In the 1st century, the Roman Empire was still in its infancy, born out of the ashes of the Old Republic. There had only been 3 Roman emperors by this time, Claudius being the 4th. In 43 AD, he had turned his gaze to the edge of his frontier and successfully conquered Britain, changing the course of history. So, how much resistance did we give, and how Roman did we become? Let's find out. Britain was conquered, crushed by the might of the Roman legions, and cowered into submission. Katakus, the king of the rebellious Colonia tribe, had fled as the Romans swept in, taking their capital Oppidum at Colchester. He had evaded capture and was still on the run, becoming a folk hero of resistance, despite losing every battle. The kings of 11 tribes had sworn fealty to the Roman Emperor Claudius, and things had pretty much settled down. As much as things were going to be, because you still had Katakus at large being a minor threat elsewhere, continuing his guerrilla war. Directly after the conquest, the 4 legions had split up, taking Oppidum after Oppidum, setting up a chain of forts connected by roads, pressing the advantage. The 2nd Augusta, led by Vespasian, is in the West Country. The 9th Hispania is in the Midlands, with Gemina not too far away. And the 20th Legion, led by Aulus Plautius, was in Cabala-Dunham. So in a nutshell, the client state was over, and Britain was now firmly under Roman rule. Even the Isle of Wight had fallen to Vespasian's 2nd Augusta. It was also ruled from a new town built a year following the conquest, the town of Londinium, the Roman capital of this new province, which was controlled by the governor of Britain, Aulus Plautius. He wasn't just the commander of the 20th Legion, he was the man who spearheaded the invasion in the first place. For the Romans, things were going well. Though it's not like the Romans had arrived and fought a united front of Britons. Far from it. Some tribes had long embraced the Roman ways and supported Rome from the start. Tribes like the Regni, who were led by a king called Tokidupus. He's the one who took a Roman name, a Tiberius Claudius, after the emperor. Actually, let's explore Tokidupus, because I glossed over him last episode. He's not your average barbarian king. Oh no, there is a high possibility he was a Roman citizen. Some historians even go as far as saying he was linked to the Senate. He's titled Rex Magnus, meaning Great King. And as for his palace, yes, palace, he's ruling from a lavish villa at Fishborn in Chichester, the Regni capital. Okay, right now I'm showing footage from Pompeii and Herculaneum, just to give you an idea of what this place might have been like. And Tokidupus' palace was much more grand than what you're seeing here. Just look at it. The pillars, the walls. This is what it would have looked like. It doesn't look very barbarian, does it? This palace is the crust of Roman society. Right. The Fishborn Roman Palace is a major villa. Even lavish by Roman standards, it's huge. These days, a condo like this would go for millions. That classic Roman Britain look is already appearing, and we're only in the first decade of the invasion. So no, Tokidupus is certainly no barbarian. If he travelled to Rome right now, well, not in 2025, but in, say, 47 AD, then he would be an equal. He'd no doubt splash his cash in the best of taverns, which weren't pubs as we know them. Not back then, they were wine bars, as the Romans much preferred wine over beer, which was considered a barbarian's drink.
This is the wine bar.
To be fair, it has a much better layout than every other pub I've ever been to.
So taverns it is. I would wager, even further, he would be welcomed into the villas of Rome's patricians. I mentioned this before in a previous video, and I will revisit it here for completion's sake. And I'm talking about the taking of hostages. Not in the modern concept, Lord no, but Julius Caesar took some of the children of the defeated tribes back to Rome. A bargaining chip. Now, that king has got to be a good boy to Rome, otherwise bad things will happen to your child. So you're a good boy, your child lives. But that child is not exactly a getting slung in Rome's equivalent of Skid Row. No, they're not a slave. They're getting brought up alongside the nobility. Now, the Romans basically kept their enemies closer, and the Romans knew how to play the long game. So there's a plus side to this. These children would receive an education, and they'd be brought up as a Roman, in the Roman ways, with the best Rome can offer. Depending on how long they were hostages for, they may have even settled in, may even had a family. So by the time they are no longer hostages and go back to their native area, they can pave the way for eventual Roman overtaking. And this practice still exists in the Middle Ages. Alexander II of Scotland was a hostage right until he was 13, in the courts of the infamous King John. He would have been there longer, but managed to give the English the slip. So, was Tokidupus subject to this? Given Britain was a client state like 100 years prior, Toki could have lived in Rome most his life. We know so little about his early years. So when his possible father, Vericus, heads to Rome, which sparked the invasion in the first place, yes, there's more to it than that, but this is the basics. I mean, this is Rome after all. Lots of politics. So Vericus heads to Rome, which sparks the invasion, and next thing you know, a load of Belgic tribes, because do remember things like the Atrebatis were from Gaul. Now all these tribes appear to be under the ruler of what appears to be a patrician from Rome, a part of the Roman nobility or something. Something is certainly going on behind the scenes, and this person is Tokidupus. And Vericus was Atrebatis. So if Tokidupus was his son, you now have an Atrebatis ruling the Regni, themselves a native Briton tribe, but over the past couple of centuries have been influenced by the Belgian Gallic tribes. So I'd wager a good bottle of scotch on him being a hostage who spent his life in Rome. I'll double down. 2 bottles of Lagavulin that not only was he brought up and educated in Rome, but said Romans prefer him to run the shop. He was very much a friend of the governor, and Tokidupus was the classic client king. So when it comes down to Katakus' rebellion, he's getting no support from Tokidupus. In fact, you can argue that Tokidupus is leading the Romanization of Britain. But, still, not everyone is living in a lavish villa as a citizen loyal to Rome. This is very much limited to the elites of society who have strong connections with Rome and the larger empire. When you venture out into the less Romanised areas, called areas of resistance, you'll see the old-style houses with the round roofs that were seen before the times of Julius Caesar. The typical Iron Age culture of the Britons, and it can be seen everywhere, unchanged for hundreds of years. And the further north you go, the more the culture changes, especially visible now the Romans have come, because tribes like the Bgandis, found around the Yorkshire moors and surrounding areas, don't even appear to be farming crops, preferring livestock. They have no wheeled pottery, preferring other methods like wood and wicker. But they're not primitive hunter-gatherers, no. They are just as Iron Age as the Regini or the Cataviloni. They are just different, much like the Silures in Wales. And another dividing point between the Britons and the Romans would be religion. And by a druid, I don't refer to the modern group of hippies who hang around Stonehenge on solstice. No. They were created in the Victorian era by a bloke called Edward Williams. There is no connection whatsoever between the modern chaps and the druids of ancient Britain. And I don't use the word mysterious flippantly, as we genuinely know very little about this ancient cult. Most of what we do know comes from the Greeks and the Romans. They tell us that the druids ran society, like any other religion. Much like the Church of the Middle Ages, the ancient druids would serve as lawmakers, teachers, doctors, as well as priests. Even back this far, in Britain anyway, we see a three-state system consisting of warriors, serfs and clergy. Clergy being the druids. And all this originates in Wales and sort of spreads out. They were exempt from tax. They were exempt from fighting in battle. When it came down to their understanding, they did have a good idea of astrology and of the way of the world. These were in no way primitive cavemen dressed in ragged cloaks. They were very much in line with the rest of the Iron Age. Though you're probably wondering how on earth an Iron Age culture, who has been embracing Roman ways for well over a century, haven't adopted a system of writing. After all someone has to do is acquire the tools. Anyone brought up in Rome would surely have understood written script. Well, under the Druids, writing was forbidden and actively suppressed. Instead, they preferred oral tradition, word of mouth, and memorising vast amounts of information. However, by the time of Julius Caesar, the Druids do appear to be using Greek letters in some private circumstances, and students are using these Greek letters as a memory aid. Just not enough to allow a written language to become mainstream, it seems. So writing is controversial, but not overly prohibited or banned about now. Though, according to the Greeks and the Romans, there was a darker side to the Druidic religion. Human sacrifice. Victims were tied to large wicker men and simply burned alive. A barbaric practice, but supported by archaeology. They even have the practice of the triple death, where you suffered three fates. You're stoned, you're drowned, and impaled. Their idea of life and death was completely different than the Romans and the Greeks. So, much like Cortes when he witnessed the Aztecs, the Romans are having the same revulsion with the Druids, who ruled from their island base in Mona. But it went both ways. The Druids strongly opposed the Romans, pretty much siding with the rebels, who continued their fight. So naturally, the Romans trying to suppress the Druids right now. And of course, you have the rebel king of the Catulloni himself, Katakus. He still hasn't been caught, and was currently biding his time in the lands of the Siluris in southern Wales. And even though he'd lost to the Romans, Katakus still had a reputation for resisting the Romans. He was a folk hero. And the defiant Katakus had not given up his resistance, his rebellion. In fact, he was plotting a new uprising, gathering just about anyone who opposed Roman occupation, as well as warriors from the Siluris tribe and the Ordovices in the Welsh West. His ranks were swelling. Oh, and as for the Siluris, they were a tribe utterly opposed to Rome. They hadn't as much sipped a Mediterranean wine, let alone owned a huge villa, unlike the quizzling Tokidupus. Much like the Bgandis, they were also unfamiliar with coinage. They hadn't even adopted the true concept of the oppidum. Like before, I'm not saying the Siluris were uncivilized or barbarians. They're just a different culture, one alien to the Romans, though the Romans would consider everyone non-Roman barbarian pretty much. And the same goes for the Western Ordovices or the Bgandis to the Welsh north. And Katakus is making alliances with them all. Or, Katakus had the Druids on his side, who were also opposed to Roman rule. And from their sacred island of Mona, they had divined and studied the stars, all kinds of sacrifices, predicting the best path to take. And soon, an opportunity would arise. But as far as the Romans are concerned, that's all in Wales, relatively far away enough to consider Britain as stable. And with stability in the region, and no real resistance from the native Celts, the governor of Britain, Aulus Claudius, was looking to retire back in Rome, and in the year 47 AD he does just that. He hangs up his sword and returns to Rome to much glory. A national hero with great honour. And here's a funny thing. It seems Claudius' wife, Pomponia, got rather attached to some of the customs of the ancient Celts, for she is accused of practicing some of their barbaric superstitions. Most probably the Druidic ways she's been exposed to while there. Others say this was Christianity, though this is highly doubtful, given Christianity was practically unheard of outside the Levant, and Pomponia had spent 4 years in the very land where the Romans are trying to stamp out the ways of the Druids. They're currently more controversial than the Christians. Whatever the case, she was acquitted. Replacing Claudius is Publius Astorius Scapula. He is made the new governor of Britain, though prior to that he was a consul in the empire, though little, if not nothing else, is known about him. Currently, he hasn't yet arrived in Britain, and the previous governor has already left. And during this small window, in the late winter of 47 AD, where Britain is without a governor, the legions had settled down for the winter, and couldn't imagine the rebels attacking during this cold and bitter time. But still, Katakus springs into action. Descending from the hills and falling upon the Roman forces. Once again, Rome was exposed to a full-scale war with the Britons. A war not confined just to the hills of Wales, though that was their main theatre. Typical of Katakus, The Britons avoided pitched battle. This was another guerrilla war. Also, this time, the Romans were in a different kind of terrain, for they were in the Welsh hills. This provides the rebels with good cover, good places to hide, the perfect camouflage, launching hit-and-run attacks on the frustrated legions. So, no sooner had Ostorius Scapula started his job as governor, he found himself embroiled in this guerrilla war against Katakus. In order to put down this rebellion, he would have to cut off the avenues of retreat, which unfortunately would use an excessive amount of manpower, extending the army further and further, exposing his forces to rebel ambushes. But there were several tactics the new governor had at his disposal, and he starts by employing a political approach, pretty much stabbing his authority on the locals and swaying them back to the arms of Rome, attempting to take the wind out of the sails of the rebellion. But it doesn't work. Things are getting out of hand, so Scapula opts to build forts all the way from the Avon to the Severn in retaliation, effectively blocking off Wales, containing the problem to Wales, well, hopefully anyway. But this also doesn't work, because over in East Anglia, the Isini were rising up. They're giving it large, a bit of Harry the Pickle, proper Jack the Lad, proper naughty. In late 47 or early 48, the Isini were rebelling, and no, it's not her. I don't foreshadow. Though Boudica was most certainly alive at this time, and she may even have been queen. It all depends on how old she was in 13 years' time during her rebellion. Her husband, Prasutagus, if not already king by this point, was certainly king soon after, installed as a puppet of Rome, due to his loyalty. And I will hastily add that the Isini were not conquered by this point. They are merely one of the 11 tribes that capitulated to Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, 4 years ago. Anyway, the Isini insurrection was localised to Norfolk and Essex, thankfully, because these hardy warriors would prove buggers to quell. Scapula only sends auxiliaries to deal with the problem, probably expecting it to be put down pretty easily, so he could concentrate with his Welsh campaign. It doesn't go as planned, it's not put down easy, and it does give the new governor quite a scare. But once the Isini Revolt was put down, Scapula prosecuted his war against Katakus. But the Isini had revealed a flaw in the Roman machine. They had proven that the Romans were vulnerable to resistance, and not everyone was a quisling like Tokidupus. Most were like Katakus, Britons who merely adopted some Roman ways, and some were less loyal than others. Now, Scapula wasted no time. But once he dealt with the Isini, he hurried his legions to Wales to face Katakus and his Silurius allies. But he understood that this rebel king knew the terrain better than he. He didn't want to race into a stalemate with a foe adept in guerrilla tactics. Instead, he took the legions north, across the top of Wales, denying the enemy an escape route for when his troops hit the south. He's blocking all routes out, and thus containing the problem. Plus he's got his row of forts from the Avon to the Severn. Actually, looking at the map, you can see why the Isini may have decided to rebel, as the 20th Legion, usually stationed right under their nose, had been mobilised to the campaign in Wales. Certainly explains why Scapula only sent auxiliaries, not the legionaries, who were occupied with the Silures. As for the Welsh campaign itself, but was this part of a long-term strategy? It's unclear. The Romans' overall plan would soon involve the suppression of the Druids in Anglesey, which is Mona, the conquest of Wales, and the invasion of the north. But right now, in this winter campaign, sort of the 47 AD to 48 AD, it looks more like a hunt for Katakus, the putting down of a rebellion, rather than an overall plan. It was shutting down Katakus's continuous defiance of Rome. But while the cats are away, the mice play, because there's more unrest. Trouble erupts in the north of England, this time with the Bgandis. It's hard to call it an uprising, as the legions hadn't travelled this far. Like the Isini, the Bgandis had not been conquered by Rome. The north was far from being under the thrall of the Roman Empire. Maybe the Romans were poking their noses in? Or maybe the Bgandis didn't like it? Maybe the Bgandis were just chancing it. And Tacitus merely tells us that the Bgandis had fallen to discord. We don't know why, as there was no Roman military influence as far as we were aware. So it couldn't be discord with the Romans. It could have been a quarrel between the tribal leaders of the Bgandis themselves, which shouldn't surprise any of us, given the Britons loved infighting. After all, this was a huge territory, and the tribe was more of a federation than a single tribe, very prone to eternal squabbles. But the warriors of the Bgandis had risen up in a quarrel, forcing Scapula to abandon his campaign in Wales. Of course, Tacitus puts Scapula in a good light, telling us he's handled the situation with professionalism, when in reality it was probably an organised scramble to face off this new northern tribe. And after a number of successful skirmishes, and the execution of key ringleaders, stability was restored to the region, and resistance was futile. Aside from this, the Romans have been around here for about 4 or 5 years by now. They are getting used to the locals and vice versa. And it's quite a long time for some Roman soldiers who were aging out of military service, and Scapula wants his legions at the top of their game. And he's used to the old boys not understanding when it's time to hand in the old sword. It's like last orders in the tavern. There's always a couple who think the bell rings for everyone but themselves. So Scapula has an idea. At Camalodunum, the old Oppidum, he'll establish a Colonia. Now, usually a Colonia would mean a settlement full of citizens, or a frontier town. Do take in mind that the Romans are invading, they've not settled yet. They are currently not bringing their families over en masse, but that's about to change. However, Colonia can also mean a retirement village for older veterans. It's got many terms. And this is what Scapula had in mind for Camalodunum. It's pretty much a military colony, where the old boys can still serve, but don't need to do any actual fighting. But should anyone threaten the shores, they could be called to don their old segmentata and fight for the glory of Rome. Wink, wink. It's a bit of a dad's army. Good. And now they can be replaced by fresh men in their prime. Bugger was, this land once belonged to the Trinovantes tribe, who weren't too pleased. They were deeply loyal to Rome. They had been loyal for years, long before Emperor Claudius invaded. They'd been loyal before Caesar. But even they were feeling that the Romans were pushing their luck. overstaying their welcome. And when Scapula demanded some of the loyal tribes to disarm and hand over their weapons, yes, Scapula was demanding this from a warrior culture. Yeah, Katakus did not need to stir up support because Scapula was doing his work for him.